Now, Taiwan is many things to us here in Australia. For decades, it was our major source of components for electronic equipment and now supplies most of our microprocessors. It's an island nation that lives under the constant threat of invasion from China and seems to have grown accustomed to that, like Californians have with living on the San Andreas Fault. It exudes a typically happy, peaceful Asian vibe, with clean streets and lots of neon lights in the downtown area of the capital, Taipei. And of course, it's the place that US politicians like Nancy Pelosi go to when they want to attract global attention and potentially spark World War III. But we don't really think of it as being one of the world's most free places, certainly not more free than us here in Australia. But in fact, that is the case, at least economically. My next guest, Scott Hargreaves, the new executive director of the Melbourne-based think tank, the Institute of Public Affairs, has uncovered some research that reveals Taiwan, after steadily growing for decades, overtook Australia on the International Index of Economic Freedom last year. He'll be explaining how this happened in a minute. But first, Scott has also written recently about the link between renewables and ESG, or Environmental, Social and Governance, the new woke rule book for anybody wanting to operate at the top of the corporate world these days. He quoted sanctimonious Australian software billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes saying a transition to renewables in Australia is, quote, not a particularly complicated equation. Let's get Scott in to elaborate. Scott, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Fred. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Now, the hypothetical transition to renewables isn't, quote, complicated equation for Cannon-Brookes, but what about the ordinary punters? How's it going to affect them?
Well, that's why this has turned into an elite project, because ordinary punters understand that they're the ones that are going to cop it in the neck. They understand that their jobs are on the line as Australian industry becomes less competitive, as gas prices go up, electricity prices go up. It's a very complicated matter, and people who live in the real world also understand that you can't just flip an entire electricity grid that's been built over 100+ years overnight, which is what Mike Cannon-Brookes seems to believe. He comes from a software world where if you're smart enough and you flip enough algorithms around and you learn to code very well, you can do amazing things, and good luck to them. But that's not how things work in the real world of transmission lines and power plants and coal mines and everything that we actually need to keep Australia warm and supplied with reliable, affordable energy.
Well, this ESG rubbish from which all this renewable policy emanates from seems to be everywhere these days. What happened to companies simply making money for their shareholders?
Absolutely, and that is the first duty of a company, to identify customers and actually serve them. And the thing that upsets me about ESG, and I wrote about Mike Cannon-Brookes because he was invited to this conference. ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. And it's probably at one level okay for companies to think about their environmental, social and governance agendas. But what it actually turns into is a package. You have to sign on for the lot. You have to sign on for climate alarmism. You have to commit to renewables. And so Mike Cannon-Brookes was the star attraction at an ESG conference where he said that he couldn't wait to take over AGL and organise to close down Bayswater Power Station in New South Wales and Loy Yang in Victoria, massive coal-fired power stations that actually provide a huge amount of baseload energy in those states. And he wanted to close them down by 2030 on the promise of all kinds of renewable energy miracles that were going to be forthcoming between now and then.